So the neighborhood and built environment and school success, right? This is about how schools are a part and why the social determinants are important to schools, but as well as important to the community. So when we look at the data, we see that the neighborhood and the zip code where a child lives can predict their likelihood of later success. Where you live is linked to things such as problem behaviors, risk for incarceration, and your earning potential. We find that Black and Hispanic Latino families are twice as likely to live in substandard housing as white families. Rural renters, which many of our partners work in rural districts and rural communities, they are more likely to live in substandard housing and to experiencing housing problems related to affordability, quality, and crowding compared to rural homeowners. And we really see that housing stability, right? Being in a house long term has a really strong impact on educational success. It's actually one of the strongest findings in the literature that children who move around a lot have really difficulty with educational success. So if we can reduce student mobility by getting them permanent housing, we're going to see better educational outcomes for both the children and the schools. Next slide, please. So this really does, and so much of what we're talking about with the social determinants ties into income and ties into jobs and ability to have successful lives and meet the needs of your family. So we see that parental income is one of the strongest factors in how children perform in school and whether they go to college and complete a college education. So we see that children with families from low incomes who live in substandard housing are more susceptible to things like adverse respiratory outcomes, lead poisoning, overcrowding, and environmental stressors. So these negative health outcomes and these negative health effects really impact our children's physical, behavioral, and cognitive development. We see increased school absences, which we know is a real crisis in many of our districts and many of our communities, and also poor academic performance. So children that grow up in poor quality or inadequate housing, which is things like poor quality, clutter, cleanliness, hazards, indoor climate, overcrowding, bundling up, having multiple families or many adults in one house, not by choice. They have higher symptoms of things like depression, anxiety, and aggression in the elementary school ages, and then in young adulthood when children come from higher quality housing or housing that fits their needs. The poor physical quality of housing, things like roof leaks, rodents, broken HVAC systems, is also associated with adverse effects on adolescent math and reading skills. I know this is a lot of data, and of course these slides will be sent out afterwards, but it's really important to me that when we talk about the social determinants that we're able every month, when we address each one, to talk about how this impacts school success and why it's an important area of concern when we want to have healthy schools and successful schools and communities. Next slide, please. So residential instability, which we talked about, really leads to poor educational outcomes. So things like data shows that young children who move 3 or more times before preschool face the most severe negative consequences. So they have issues with cognitive, emotional, and behavioral development. In the early elementary years, they tend to score lower on reading and math tests, excuse me, than families with stable homes. And that really, of course, impacts all the way through middle school and adulthood. Adolescents, in turn, are more likely to have adverse social and behavioral outcomes that impact their educational achievement and educational attainment. So you can see where having strong housing stock and strong and stable housing in the community really does impact school success. So households with low incomes, right? So it comes into income and jobs and availability of housing that's affordable. So those with low incomes, they tend to move at twice the rate of families with higher incomes. And that's generally because of the housing cost burden, structural and environmental housing problems, trying to find housing that's safer and more secure, neighborhood violence that they move to avoid, and foreclosures and evictions. Next slide, please. So housing and the community and the built environment also relates to successful schools. So where we see schools in high poverty areas and racially and ethnically segregated, they tend to have less qualified teachers and lower average academic achievement. School quality is often related to what the opportunity is as defined by that relationship between schools and communities. So things like socioeconomic status, student distribution, neighborhood influences, access to resources, and economic segregation can all play a role in the school district's success. I bring this up because one of the things that's exciting is this doesn't have to be the, the situation. You can have high performing schools and successful schools in areas where, income, but we have to be aware that income and the socioeconomic status of the communities where schools are located can play a real role in student outcomes. So when we see children living in income segregated neighborhoods that are predominantly populated by those in poverty, those schools are more likely to have disparate access to funding, right? They have lower funding. Often, how do we fund schools? It's based on property taxes. If you have low property tax values, you're going to have low money for the school. And so they have less access to funding and resources than their wealthier peers. So students that attend schools with peers from families with higher income, where the income is mixed in the school district, are up to 68% more likely to enroll in a four-year college than students who attend schools segregated by lower income. So a district that's predominantly, we hear about districts that are 80 or 90% free and reduced lunch. And those school districts, they have a harder time helping and making sure that every student is successful. So a study that Michigan State University did that looked at academic achievement and attendance at the 21 schools in the boundaries of Flint, Michigan, found evidence that school neighborhoods impacted academic achievement. So specifically, students that were exposed or in the school was located in an economically disadvantaged neighborhood, regardless of where they lived, even if they moved in or lived in a higher income area, had tended to have poor academic skills. So the school and the community go hand in hand, and the success of the community and the success of the school are really related to each other.